Thank you all for coming here today and for having me. My name is James Formosa. I served in the Canadian Armed Forces from April 2017 until the 5th of July 2022. Thank you for your support. And I retired at the ripe old age of 30. Not exactly the way I was expecting my career to pan out, but I couldn't have asked for a better journey and experience, especially since it brought me here in front of all of you today. And if other people are recording this, there's going to be lots of recordings. I encourage you to share with as many people as you possibly can the information I'm about to share with you today, because the things I have to tell you are things that both the Canadian government and the Canadian military desperately do not want you to know about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on my career, what happened to folks like myself and around 12 or 1,300 of my fellow brothers and sisters in the past year, as well as giving you some guiding posts for the light at the end of the tunnel and how I see things going for us moving forward. So first of all, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 2017 after finishing my education. I got two liberal arts degrees. I double majored in undergrad in history and philosophy, where my area of special interest was the history of the Soviet Union. And then I got a master's degree in philosophy, where I specialized in ethics. And after seeing the ideological possession of the universities and academia, particularly with Marxism, I thought it best to instead change the track of my life and join a traditionally conservative institution. And in my infinite wisdom, I joined the Trudeau Liberals Canadian Armed Forces. So I learned very quickly that the institution was not something like what I was expecting it to be. Now, that being said, in the early years of my career, I made wonderful connections, wonderful friendships and bonds of fellowship that will last a lifetime, and they continue to this day, and they'll be with me till the day I die. Nevertheless, I noticed that things were changing very drastically for the worse a little bit over a year ago. So in my career, I'm thankful to say that I had a spotless military record, but for one thing. My one problem is that I refused to follow a particular order. And the issue is that we actually, as both officers and non-commissioned members of the armed forces, we have a moral duty and a responsibility not to follow or to refuse to comply with orders that we have reason to believe are manifestly unlawful. Now, the order in question that I believe still, and I maintain to this day, to be manifestly unlawful was CDS Directive 002, which was from the Chief of Defense Staff at the very top, mandating down to every member of the Canadian Armed Forces that they must take part in an experimental injection. Now, as this was going on, in the beginning it actually wasn't even a mandate, it was just very strongly encouraged, but I knew the direction that this was going. So I was already writing letters to my chain of command, warning them about the upcoming segregation and discrimination that we were going to face in the forces, that if they were to institute a policy like this, it would flagrantly violate both the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Human Rights Act under prohibited grounds of discrimination. And my concerns, of course, were met with either deaf ears or outright antagonism, because as I made these concerns known, even before the directive came down, instead of any sort of direct response coming to my endless emails, instead emails were rather given out by some of my immediate superiors to my leadership in my battery, letting them know that there were certain people with unacceptable views, this is going to start sounding familiar, who were a cancer to the institution, and that our duty as leaders was to tell all of our soldiers that they should take part in this experiment, whether we agree with it or not. And that was what they considered to be our command responsibility, but I vehemently disagreed. Now, as this was going on, once it did become a mandate, things changed quite drastically for those of us that refused to comply. While I still had a job, I was posted out at CFB Shiloh as an artillery officer in Manitoba until July 5th when I moved here to Ottawa. I was allowed to still go to work and do some menial administrative tasks in my office, at my desk, at my computer, but I was no longer allowed to participate in any field exercises or get in any of the green Army vehicles, even though I worked right next to these same folks in the office within 2 feet of them. I could not participate in the actual business of developing and training our military like I had done for the past several years. Now, a lot of this also culminated in the past fall when I was still attempting to expand my career and get more training, where I was sent to New Brunswick in Gagetown to do another course for my trades training in the artillery. And while I was there, because of my medical status, I had to quarantine. And I was told that I must quarantine in their facility on the base until my test results came back from the one testing center in Moncton through which all of the province's testing was being filtered at the time. What this meant for me was that I ended up being in isolation for 17 days. And as a matter of fact, it could have ended up being closer to a month of staying in a small room about 10 feet by 10 feet. Because I actually managed to get back to Manitoba, and a week after I got back to Manitoba and I was self-isolating there was when I got the call up from the lab letting me know that my results were in. Nevertheless, while I was stuck in this self-isolation, they did let me out for about 10 minutes of yard time in the morning and afternoon, which is a little bit less than I think what they give in supermax prisons. And I also had to fill out a piece of paper, according to, of course, to the base policy. I had to sign on a sheet of paper every hour on the hour with the exact date and time that I was washing my hands while I was locked alone in a room with nobody else around me. Okay. And they were very particular that I had the right dates and times down there. Nevertheless, while I was in that period of 17 days of isolation, it was this past October, you may recall, that was when JT came on the news cameras and he let everyone in the country know that forces members that refused to comply would be placed on leave without pay effective November 15th. So in that case, you would not be able to collect EI, you couldn't get another job, and they weren't going to pay you. And so on November 15th last year, I started growing this for the playoffs, and I said that I wouldn't trim it until he stopped paying me. And well, technically I'm still waiting on my pension payouts, but I don't know if I can really hold on to this until I'm 60. I look like Yosemite Sam. Nevertheless, he didn't stop paying me until, well, not in the normal sense you might imagine, until July 5th when I released. And I might add as well that when I released on July 5th, that's a little bit over 2 weeks after June 14th. And what happened on June 14th was the federal government, including the armed forces, suspended CDS Directive 002. So I was released a little bit over 2.5 weeks after for not following an order that was suspended and nullified for everyone in the forces, yet they retired me early anyway. And I'm still, to this day, getting messages from folks that are still serving currently who are in the very near future facing their imminent release from the forces because and this is what's being said by their chain of command, that you broke a rule back when it was a rule, and so we still need to punish you now even though it's suspended. Now, furthermore, it's very interesting. You can see that there's a lot of internal struggle, I think, going on in the higher echelons of the forces as they're doing a lot of this unprecedented policy work, because clearly the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and there seems to be a vested interest in preventing people from knowing exactly the way that they're even supposed to implement their own policy. That being said, part of the reason why I was released is because of my steadfast commitment, my unwavering devotion to not only the principles for why I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, but also for my personal faith in Jesus Christ. And this should deeply concern all of you, even if you don't share the same faith background as I do. And I'll explain a little bit in detail why this is so concerning and should be concerning regardless of your personal beliefs or backgrounds. Now, when they instituted this mandate, they gave what seemed to be ways out for people in terms of protecting their career as well as their conscience. And when they said, you can submit a request for religious accommodation, medical accommodation, or some sort of accommodation under the protected grounds of the Canadian Human Rights Act under prohibited grounds of discrimination. That being said, I submitted a religious accommodation request wherein I used scripture to explain my personal beliefs and what I read directly from scripture as it describes the human conscience as the voice of the Holy Spirit, which is convicting you whether you like it or not. If something happens or if you do something that you know in your conscience to be wrong, that conviction you feel is something that we can't escape because it doesn't really come from us. It comes from something much greater. Now, that being said, I was, in the course of all of my correspondence back and forth with Ottawa, told that in various ways by folks with theological degrees and who went to seminary that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that the arguments I was making about the nature of conscience and the Holy Spirit was a mere argument from conscience, not religion. Or furthermore, they said that I did not tie my religious beliefs to any corporate religious authority, which should also deeply concern all of you that the Canadian military believes it has the right and authority to judge any Canadian citizen with regards to what constitutes an appropriate religious authority by their estimation. I don't think they have a right to do anything of the kind, never have and never will. Now, that being said, they also told me that, well, this concern about the corporate religious authority is also in direct violation of their own policies, because the Canadian Armed Forces has something called the Defense Administrative Orders and Directives. This is the rule book that everyone has to follow, from the lowliest private all the way up to the Chief of Defense Staff himself. Now, in the DAODs, there is a section for religious and spiritual accommodation, where it gives everybody in the forces the guidelines of how they're supposed to do that process. And in that process, it very clearly in black and white states that any soldier coming to the chain of command with a sincere personal belief does not need to have their belief conform to any religious authority or tradition whatsoever. And that's meant to protect all of us, regardless of our backgrounds or personal beliefs, because it recognizes something essential about our humanity that we can't have taken away from us. And if there's one point that I could impress upon everybody today that you don't forget about and that you tell everyone you meet after this event, is let them know how the Canadian Armed Forces in this particular case, even though they opened up this doorway saying you can submit a religious request, a medical request, or the Canadian Human Rights Act request, at the very outset in my regiment out in Shiloh, we were told from the very beginning, we will not entertain any arguments from personal conscience whatsoever. So for this totally new, unprecedented event, we have found a case where you, the soldiers, your conscience does not matter. It does not factor in. We will not even look at it. Don't even bother submitting something that's an argument from conscience. And even when I gave my theological argument, you can see how they tried to shoehorn it into a conscience argument just so that they could dismiss it without actually dealing with the particulars of my beliefs. Now, that being said, also, as I was going through this, I sent a lot of paperwork back to Ottawa, and you'll notice I was released 5F from the Canadian Forces, which means unsuitable for further service. Now, it's kind of strange in the contradiction in the way they described my release, because it's a 5F release, unsuitable for further service. It was an honorable discharge because I conducted myself in such an honorable fashion. However, it says in the particulars of my release message, it says Captain Formosa is to be honorably released from the Canadian Armed Forces due to personal and or domestic problems within his control and because he is an excessive administrative burden to the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'd like to give you a little bit of the details as to why I was such an administrative burden, because I wrote hundreds of pages to Ottawa that they're still wrestling with to this day. Some of the things that I gave them, for instance, was arguments like I just gave you, how they're flagrantly violating their own policy to force certain people out for what I would argue is an ideologically motivated agenda. Another thing that they took part in, when they set up this process for accommodations, they said that they would treat everybody fairly and equally. We'll do it on a case-by-case basis and make sure that you're all given the equal amount of respect and consideration. Now, I still have questions for Ottawa, because all the way up to the Chief of Defense Staff himself, they have still yet to give me any answers to some of these questions, like, when I went on the D&D intranet computers, so everybody in the forces has access to this. If there's currently serving members watching, they can also check this out themselves on the DWAN. You go on your computer and you can look up the statistical data for this accommodation process. And at the time that I pulled the information, which was roughly back in March, it said that for all of the religious accommodation requests submitted, around 14.6% of captains were approved, 55% of majors were approved, and 100% of lieutenant colonels were approved for their accommodations. So they didn't have to take something, and they got to keep their career. Furthermore, I sent a very exhaustive Excel spreadsheet. Wow, it's almost like I was doing all that nerdy officer work that they paid me for. I sent them a huge Excel spreadsheet showing that there was, in fact, anywhere between a 3,000 to 5,000% overrepresentation in accommodations being approved in a few specific areas, namely places like Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, policy branch where they come up with a lot of these policies. 1 Division Air HQ, Ottawa. So in other words, if I wasn't posted way out there in Manitoba, if I was playing golf with the right colonels in Ottawa, I'd probably still have a career. Now that's just my biased read on it, but at least I'm honest with all you good folks when I inject a little bit of bias in there. Another thing that was also quite concerning to me as I was nearing the end of my career was that while I was still a troop commander at the 1st Regiment Royal Canadian Horse Artillery in Shiloh, I was responsible for the weekly training schedule for my soldiers. So I gave them a lesson from my background in studying the history of the Soviet Union, where I taught them about Yuri Bezmenov and the stages of Soviet subversion. If anybody's interested, you can go to the Veterans for Freedom YouTube channel, where in the last couple of weeks we had a show and I went over the exact same slideshow presentation explaining how, from the KGB's perspective, how they sought to infiltrate Western democratic institutions with Marxism. Now, I taught this to my troops in 2 different troops, so that was roughly 100 soldiers total, explaining this to them because I wanted to give my soldiers the best intellectual tools in their toolbox to face the coming challenges both in our society and in the world at large. So of course I was admonished after giving these classes by my immediate superior, who said that I needed to stop giving my troops irrelevant training. So that just gives you an idea as well as the caliber of some of the leadership in the forces. Another thing, again, though, now I should probably switch gears a little bit to give you some of the light at the end of the tunnel, because this does sound quite awful. There are clearly bad moves being made by people in positions of authority who don't have any real right to be where they are. Now, there was something strange that happened in Ottawa in January, but something that a lot of Canadians don't know about, and a lot of even maybe my fellow soldiers, if they're still serving, they might not know about this. There was a strange phenomenon also going on at all of the if not all of the Canadian Forces bases, certainly at a lot of the combat arms units. So I got back from Christmas vacation this past year, the first week of January, fully expecting to go back into my regiment, albeit with the restrictions that were imposed on me, but I could still go in the office and see all the folks I worked with. But that wasn't the case for me, and it wasn't the case for anybody else at my regiment, because when we got back from our Christmas break, we were told from the divisional commander, so a commander in Edmonton who oversees not only the regiments in Shiloh, but also regiments in Alberta and in British Columbia, sent the message from the top down to all of us, letting us know that we'd be working from home this week. And in other words, stay at home in your PJs, play video games, and don't interact with each other as much as you can. And what happened was everybody stayed at home for that first week. And then at the end of the week, at the end of Friday, we got another message at the final hour, again coming down from Edmonton, from the highest level of command for that region of Canada, once again letting us know, oh, by the way, for the next week, you're also going to work from home. Stay at home, have as little interaction with other people as possible, of course in the interest of your safety. We got to the end of the second week. At the end of the second week, the final hour of Friday, we were told to work from home yet again. And the way that it ended up turning out was I don't believe anybody from my regiment actually ever returned to work until we were around the time that the Emergencies Act was actually being repealed. So for that whole period, while everybody had their eyes on Ottawa, so did a lot of our forces members, because they were told just not to come into work and not to do the business of soldiering. Now, I thought it was something strange, maybe, of course, for where I was, and that it was happening in the entirety of CFB Shiloh. But after explaining this at another meeting in the past week, I got messages from other folks all the way out in Eastern Canada saying the same thing was happening for them during that whole time frame. So whether we like to accept it or not, a large swath, if not nearly the entirety of the armed forces was on an extended Christmas vacation, not coming into work, not interacting with each other, not speaking face to face. And the thing that should encourage you all, despite the fact that something like that happened, is now this is when, full disclosure here, I'm just giving you my assessment and my read on this, but I have a feeling that there was deep-seated concerns, especially in Ottawa, with the level of support that the Canadian people has from the regular rank and file members who serve in our Canadian Armed Forces. Because I was getting asked this by a lot of the troops. They were asking me, Captain Formosa, when are we going to slap a Canadian flag on the side of a lav and drive on down to Ottawa and start flipping burgers at the barbecue? When are we going to get to start playing with the kids at the bouncy castles? Because they knew that none of us, if we were asked to come to Ottawa, there's a vast silent majority that would not betray their conscience and would not turn against the Canadian people during one of the largest peaceful protests in the history of our nation. That's something that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, and I hope it's also impressing upon you folks as well, the fact that there is an incredible amount of support from some of the folks with the greatest integrity and courage that we have. Now, to end this off, I'd like to give you just a little bit of an idea of the way I see things going forward and how we as individuals can have a tremendous impact just in our personal lives. So, for my part, if I'm going to take the tack of speaking to my faith, I had an incredible amount of eye-opening conversations, even as I was going through this process with my chain of command. You wouldn't believe the kind of bug-eyed expressions I saw from various majors and colonels when I told them that the book of Revelation written by the Apostle John says in chapter 18, verses 23, and the great men of the merchants of the earth were deceived. And sorry, let me start over. Revelation 18, chapter 23 says, "For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, and by their sorceries were all nations deceived." And when that was written by the Apostle John in the original Greek, the word sorceries was pharmakeia. And you wouldn't believe the kind of response I got from my chain of command. Furthermore, they didn't know how to deal with somebody explaining from the book of Romans the nature of conscience, or saying from the Beatitudes, when Jesus said in Matthew, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And there's a very important reason why Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you. The greatest, single, most transcendental message that I could give, besides the salvation message itself that comes from the Bible, is this idea that imagine how amazing the earth could be. Imagine how beautiful and pure and wonderful this planet could be if we could all love one another and forgive one another and have the same kind of empathy and compassion for each other that God has for us and that God believes we are capable of. He believes in you. He has a plan for your life. You're not an accident. You're not a mistake. You're here for a purpose. And that's the kind of message that we all know who they are desperately, desperately afraid of you knowing that there's this kind of message out here, that there's a message of hope and peace and never-ending, ever-enduring love. It's something that runs contrary to all of the messaging and the psychological operations that we have been fed for the past year, and it's something that they desperately want to remove from the military. That's why they gave no room for an argument from conscience. That's why the vast majority of a lot of the folks that were most quickly removed for religious accommodations are among the most faithful Christians and the ones that refuse to compromise on what the Bible says. Now, in our own personal lives, the way that we can have a tremendous impact, of course, is by making choices every single day. So, for instance, a lot of us have this general sense, and I think it's a fairly good one, this idea that there will be a return to there will be an attempt, let's say, by those in power to return us to the way that we had been living for quite a long time in the past couple of years. And I have to say, just like I told my soldiers, and it was actually mentioned by one of the earlier speakers, you don't just lie with your mouth. You can lie with your body. And if they make you lie with your body, it's a great moral and spiritual injury upon yourself. When you do something like this, that you know in your heart and mind and soul to be wrong, it's inherently emasculating. And I told my fellow officers that it should become no wonder that if we become an institution of a bunch of emasculated liars, there's no telling what sort of stuff they may order us to do in the future and how many would be willing to go along with it. And that being said, there is a tremendous undercurrent of hope and of unity and of the courageous men and women. I'm coming to you here. I only had a 5-year career, and I'm here with you recognizing that I stand on the shoulder of giants, of men and women far braver than I have, who shed their blood and gave the ultimate sacrifice so that I could have the freedom to come here and tell you exactly what I think and feel and believe here today. That's a tremendous honor and a privilege. And I hope that you all keep that close to you in your hearts, and you know that when you go out into the world, you can do something kind of like, this is a great idea. It came from my mother. She's doing it wherever she goes now, and I can't recommend it enough. With her acquaintances, her neighbors, whoever she goes out to meet, whenever the opportunity arises, or she'll make an opportunity to ask somebody, if mandates and restrictions come back in the fall, are you going to comply? And of course, her answer is always no. And with most of the people she speaks to, the answer is a resounding no. I will never go back to that again. And I'm here to tell you, and with God as my witness, I will never wear a mask again as long as I live. There's an authority that I am subservient to that I must follow, and I will not be made to bow to the whims of petty authoritarians who despise me and want to destroy my nation. And you should not allow the same thing to be done to you. So, thank you all for having me here today. I would love to speak to you all after if I get a chance. You can find me on the YouTube channel Veterans for Freedom, as well as my personal channel at James Formosa, as well as my Patreon, because in my infinite selfishness, as they say, I turned down a six-figure salary for absolutely zero. So any support out of the generosity of your heart is greatly appreciated. If you believe in journalism with integrity, please follow Veterans for Freedom. God bless you all. God save Canada.
James Formosa. Save Canada, rally in the valley. Casey out.